Arizona Territory, 1874. The summer heat shimmered across the desert as Boone Nichols pushed his sweat-soaked hat back on his head and surveyed the parched landscape. At 25, he'd already spent more years on horseback than most men twice his age, and the frontier had etched its loneliness into him like the dry riverbeds cut into the earth. The Apache Wars had left their mark on this territory, blood spilled over land neither side truly owned, only borrowed from time. "Frontier ain't made for settling down," Boone muttered to his sorrel-gelding Thunder. "Just survival from one day to the next." The horse nickered softly as if in disagreement, but Boone paid it no mind. He'd seen too many good men die chasing dreams of family and fortune in this unforgiving country. His own pa had died with a Comanche arrow in his chest when Boone was just 14, his mother following not 6 months later from grief and typhoid. Since then, Boone had ridden alone, taking work where he could find it, never staying in one place long enough for roots to take hold. Today he was tracking strays from the Rocking R Ranch, where he'd hired on 3 months back. Mr. Richardson was a fair boss, but the drought had stretched everyone thin, cattle and cowboys alike. The herd had scattered in search of water, and Boone had been tasked with finding the missing animals before they fell prey to rustlers or wolves. The sun hung low on the horizon when he spotted smoke rising in the distance. Not the billowing clouds of a wildfire, but the controlled plume of a campfire. Caution slowed his approach. Apache raiders still struck occasionally, despite the recent peace treaties, and outlaws found plenty of hiding places in these remote canyons. Thunder's ears pricked forward as they descended into a small wash. Water. A slender trickle coursed through the sandy bottom, barely enough to wet a man's boots, but in this drought it might as well have been the Mississippi. And beside it a figure hunched over something on the ground, a woman. Even from this distance he could tell that much. Boone drew his Winchester from its scabbard and approached slowly. "Hello, the camp," he called when he was still 50 yards out, not wanting to startle her. The figure spun around, and Boone found himself staring down the barrel of an old army Colt. "That's far enough," she called, her voice clear and steady despite the slight tremble in her hand. Boone reined Thunder to a halt and raised one hand in a peaceful gesture, keeping the rifle pointed skyward in the other. "Mean no harm, ma'am. Just tracking cattle for the Rocking R." She didn't lower her pistol, and as his eyes adjusted he could see why. She wore a simple calico dress, torn and trail-stained, but her high cheekbones, dark eyes, and long black hair spoke of her Apache heritage. Beside her lay a bundle, no, a person wrapped in blankets despite the heat. "Your cattle ain't here," she said. "Move along." Something in her voice, desperation perhaps, made Boone pause. "You need help?" he asked, nodding toward the bundle. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion plain as day. Why would a white man help Apache? "Same reason any Christian would help someone in need," Boone replied, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. Most settlers would ride on by if they didn't shoot first. But something about her proud stance, protecting whoever lay behind her despite her obvious exhaustion, stirred something in Boone he thought had died with his parents. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Name's Boone Nichols. I got food and medicine in my saddlebags. Your friend there looks like they could use both." For a long moment she stood unwavering, the pistol steady now. Then, as if some internal calculation had been made, she lowered the gun slightly. "My grandmother," she said, 3 days with fever, cannot travel." Boone nodded, keeping his distance. "I got quinine and whiskey. Might help the fever." "Why help?" she asked again, suspicion still edging her voice. Boone shrugged. "Desert don't care what color your skin is, kills everyone the same." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed her face before she gestured him forward with a curt nod. As he approached, he saw she was younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 22 or 23, with a delicate beauty that the trail dust and worry couldn't hide. The old woman on the ground moaned softly, her face flushed with fever. "What's your name?" Boone asked as he dug through his saddlebags for the small medical kit he carried, a hesitation. "Moira," another pause, "Moira Elkhorn." It wasn't her Apache name, that much was clear, but Boone didn't press. Many Indian children had been given Christian names at the missions or government schools, willingly or otherwise. "Your grandmother needs more than I can do here," he said after examining the old woman. Her pulse was weak and rapid, her breathing shallow. "There's a doctor in Palo Verde about 15 miles west." Moira's face hardened. "They will not treat Apache there." "They will if I bring you," Boone said with more confidence than he felt. "Doc Wilson's a good man, treated Navajo and Pima before." She studied him, her dark eyes searching his face for deception. Boone met her gaze steadily. At 25, his face was weathered from sun and wind, but not yet hardened by bitterness or hate like so many frontier men. His light brown hair curled damply at his neck and 3 days of stubble shadowed his jaw. "Why would you do this?" she asked finally. Boone looked down at the old woman, remembering his mother's final days, how helpless he'd felt watching fever consume her. "Because it's right," he said simply, "and because no one should die alone in the desert if it can be helped." Moira's expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened slightly. "If you betray us—" "I won't," Boone interrupted. "You can keep that pistol on me the whole way if it makes you feel better." That night they made camp by the trickle of water. Boone fashioned a travois for the old woman, which they'd attach to Thunder come morning. Over a small fire he heated coffee and shared his jerky and beans with Moira. "How'd you end up out here?" he asked as they ate. Moira's eyes reflected the firelight as she considered her answer. "We were traveling to the San Carlos reservation. Grandmother refused to go at first, but the soldiers—" She trailed off, the memory clearly painful. "We were separated from our group in a dust storm 3 days ago. Then she fell ill." Boone nodded. He'd heard about the forced relocations. "And your parents?" "Dead. Cavalry attack 2 winters ago." She said it flatly, as if reciting facts about strangers. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. She shrugged. "Many died, Apache white settlers. This land drinks much blood." They fell silent, the crackling fire and the old woman's, labored breathing the only sounds in the desert night. Boone watched Moira across the flames, noting how she checked on her grandmother every few minutes, how she held herself with dignity despite their desperate circumstances. "You should sleep," he said eventually. "I'll keep watch." Moira's hand drifted to the pistol at her side. "I will watch." Boone nodded, understanding her caution. "Then we both watch. Can't travel tomorrow without some rest." In the end, exhaustion won out. Moira slept fitfully beside her grandmother while Boone kept vigilance, wondering what madness had prompted him to involve himself in the plight of 2 Apache women. The frontier had taught him that survival meant looking out for oneself first. Attachments were dangerous, they made a man vulnerable. Yet here he was, risking his job, maybe even his life, for strangers. As dawn broke across the eastern sky, Boone gently shook Moira awake. Her hand immediately went to her pistol, eyes alert despite her fatigue. "We should move while it's still cool," he said, already preparing the travois. They traveled slowly, the old woman secured to the travois dragged by Thunder. Boone walked alongside, leading his horse, while Moira alternated between walking and riding double when the terrain allowed. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, and they sought shelter beneath a rocky overhang. "Grandmother is worse," Moira said, her voice tight with worry as she pressed a damp cloth to the old woman's forehead. Boone checked the elder's pulse. Weak, thready. "We'll make Palo Verde by nightfall," he promised, though he wasn't certain the old woman would last that long. As they rested, a cloud of dust on the horizon caught his attention. Riders moving fast. "Someone's coming," he warned, grabbing his rifle. Moira tensed, following his gaze. "Soldiers." "Don't think so," Boone squinted against the glare. "Riders are too bunched up, probably cowboys or—" He broke off as recognition dawned. "Trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Moira's hand moved to her pistol. "Dalton brothers." "Local trash with a taste for causing harm." Boone's jaw tightened. "And they don't much like Indians." 4 riders approached, slowing as they spotted Boone and his companions beneath the overhang. Boone stepped forward, rifle held casually but ready. "Afternoon, Nichols," the lead rider called, a thin man with a pockmarked face and mean eyes. "Found yourself some company, I see." His gaze slid to Moira with undisguised interest. "Just helping these folks to town, Dalton," Boone replied evenly. "Doctor's business." Jeb Dalton's lip curled. "Mighty charitable of you, since when do cowboys play nurse to squaws?" His brothers snickered, spreading out slightly in a way that made Boone's skin prickle with warning. "Since it ain't your concern," Boone answered, his voice hardening. "Now we appreciate the social call, but we've got ground to cover before dark." "Maybe we ought to escort you," Dalton suggested with false friendliness. "Roads can be dangerous, especially for a man traveling alone with Indian women." "We're managing just fine." Boone shifted subtly, making sure he stood between the Daltons and Moira. "That old one looks about done for," one of the brothers observed. The young one, though, his eyes lingered on Moira in a way that made Boone's blood boil. "You boys move along now," Boone said, his finger resting near the Winchester's trigger. "Nothing here concerns you." Jeb Dalton's smile vanished. "Everything in this territory concerns me, Nichols, especially Apache filth where they don't belong." His hand drifted toward his holster. "4 against 1, Boone," another brother taunted. "Them odds don't favor you." 4 against 2, Moira corrected coldly, stepping up beside Boone with her Colt drawn. "And I do not miss." Something in her steady voice, or perhaps the unwavering aim of her pistol, gave Dalton pause. After a tense moment he forced a laugh. "Another day maybe," he said, gathering his reins. "See you in town, Nichols." His eyes flicked to Moira. "Both of you." They rode off, dust billowing behind them. "They will return," Moira stated once they were out of earshot. "I know," Boone agreed grimly, "which means we need to reach town before nightfall, ready to move." As they continued their journey, Boone found himself impressed by Moira's endurance and determination. Despite her worry for her grandmother, she maintained a steady pace, never complaining about the heat or terrain. "You learned English well," he observed as they walked. A shadow passed over her face. "Mission school." 3 years. "You didn't want to go." "Children were taken, not asked," she replied simply. "But I learned their language, their God, their ways, useful for surviving in a world that changes whether we wish it to or not." Her pragmatism struck Boone. In many ways they shared the same philosophy, adapt or perish. The frontier didn't forgive weakness or sentimentality. "Your people," he began hesitantly, "will they be looking for you?" Moira's expression remained impassive. "Perhaps, but many bands have surrendered to the reservations now. The old ways are dying." The sadness beneath her stoic words touched something in Boone. He too had watched his world disappear. The small Texas ranch of his childhood, his parents, the future he'd once imagined. "The frontier changed everyone it touched. Not everything that changes is lost," he said, surprising himself with the sentiment. Moira glanced at him, her dark eyes assessing. "Some things should not be lost." They reached Palo Verde just as dusk was falling. The small settlement consisted of little more than a general store, saloon, livery, and a scatter of houses. Light spilled from the saloon windows, carrying sounds of piano music and laughter into the dusty street. Boone felt more tense beside him as heads turned to watch their approach. An Apache woman in town was uncommon enough to draw attention, even without the old woman on the travois. "Doc Wilson's place is at the end of the street," Boone told her quietly. "Keep your head up and stay close." A few men loitering outside the saloon straightened as they passed, muttering among themselves. Boone nodded curtly to those he recognized, his hand never straying far from his holster. At the doctor's house, a tidy whitewashed building with a small sign reading, "J. Wilson, Physician," Boone rapped sharply on the door. After a moment, it opened to reveal a middle-aged man with spectacles and a graying beard. "Boone Nichols," the doctor greeted him, then his eyes widened as he took in Moira and the travois. "What's this about?" "Elderly woman with high fever," Boone explained quickly. "Been sick 3-4 days now, needs your help, Doc." Wilson hesitated, looking past them to the street, where curious onlookers had begun to gather. "Boone, you know I can't." "You can and you will," Boone interrupted firmly. "I'm paying cash money." "Same as anyone else." The doctor sighed, removing his spectacles to rub the bridge of his nose. Bring her in through the back, quickly, before there's trouble. Relief flooded through Boone. He nodded his thanks and motioned for Moira to follow as they led Thunder around to the rear of the house. Together, they carried her grandmother inside to a small examination room. "How long has she been like this?" Wilson asked, professional demeanor taking over as he examined his patient. "4 days," Moira answered, hovering anxiously. "Started with coughing, then fever came." The doctor listened to the old woman's chest with his stethoscope, his expression grave. "Pneumonia most likely, she's very dehydrated." He looked up at Moira. "I'll do what I can, but I won't lie to you, her age and condition don't favor recovery." Moira nodded stoically, though Boone saw her hands clench at her sides. "You can stay here tonight," Wilson continued, surprising them both. "There's a small room in the back, but come morning you'll need to move on. This town," he trailed off. "We understand," Boone assured him. "Thank you, Doc." As Wilson prepared medicine and Moira stayed by her grandmother's side, Boone stepped outside to tend to Thunder. The gathered crowd had dispersed, but the uneasy feeling lingered. News traveled fast in small towns, and the Dalton brothers had likely spread word of their encounter. Later, in the cramped back room of Wilson's house, Boone and Moira sat in silence. The old woman rested fitfully on a narrow cot while they shared the only chair and a spot on the floor. "You should return to your ranch," Moira said suddenly. "You have done enough, more than most would." Boone shook his head. "And leave you here alone, with the Daltons looking for trouble." "No, ma'am." "Why do you care what happens to us?" she challenged, her dark eyes searching his face in the dim lamplight. It was a question Boone had been asking himself since their paths crossed. By all rights, their peoples were enemies. The sensible thing would be to ride away, back to the Rocking R, to the simple life of a cowboy with no attachments or complications. "I don't rightly know," he admitted finally. "Except that it seems to me there's been enough suffering in these territories without adding more." He paused. "And you remind me that there's more to living than just surviving." Moira studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him truly for the first time. At 25, Boone possessed a quiet strength that came from years of self-reliance. His hazel eyes held none of the hatred or fear she'd come to expect from white men. "My people have a saying," she offered quietly. "The path is made by walking it." She glanced at her grandmother. "Perhaps our paths were meant to cross." Something shifted between them in that moment, a tentative bridge across the divide of their different worlds. The old woman died before dawn. Despite Wilson's medicines and Moira's constant care, she slipped away quietly as the first light of morning colored the eastern sky. Boone awoke to find Moira sitting beside the cot, her grandmother's withered hand clasped between her own, tears sliding silently down her face. Wordlessly, he moved to sit beside her, offering the only comfort he could, his presence. After a long while, Moira spoke, her voice steady despite her grief. "She was the last of my family," she said. "The keeper of our stories, our ways." "I'm sorry," Boone replied softly, remembering his own losses. "What will you do now?" Moira straightened her shoulders. "Bury her properly." Then she trailed off, uncertainty crossing her features for the first time since he'd met her. "The reservation," Boone suggested gently, her expression hardened. "Not San Carlos. Death waits there, disease, starvation. Perhaps I will find my cousin's band in the mountains." Dr. Wilson helped them arrange a quiet burial at the edge of town. Few attended, only the doctor, the local preacher, who came reluctantly, Boone and Moira. As the simple service concluded, Boone noticed riders approaching from town, the Dalton brothers, accompanied by several other men. "We've got trouble," he murmured to Moira, who stood proud and straight beside her grandmother's fresh grave. "Figured we'd find you here," Jeb Dalton called as they reined up several yards away. "Town meeting last night voted. No Apache allowed in Palo Verde. Council sent us to escort you out." His thin smile suggested the escort would be anything but peaceful. "The woman just buried her grandmother," Boone replied, stepping forward. "Show some respect." "Respect," another man spat. "After what her kind did to the Reynolds family last spring, butchered the whole lot of them. That wasn't her, Boone countered. They're all the same, Dalton declared. Now step aside, Nichols. Our business is with the squaw. My name is Moira Elkhorn, she said clearly, moving to stand beside Boone, and I will leave when I am ready. One of the Dalton brothers laughed. Listen to that. Savage speaks English better than you, Jeb. Shut your mouth, Jeb snapped, then fixed his gaze on Boone. Last chance to walk away, cowboy. This ain't your fight. Boone's hand rested on his holster. Seems like it is now. Doctor. Wilson moved between the groups, hands raised placatingly. There's no need for violence, gentlemen. The burial is complete. I'm sure Miss Elkhorn was planning to leave town afterward. Weren't you, my dear? Moira nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Dalton's face. See, no trouble necessary, Wilson continued. Give them an hour to collect their things and they'll be on their way. Dalton considered this, clearly disappointed at the prospect of being denied a confrontation. 1 hour, he agreed finally, and Nichols goes with her. Town don't need Indian lovers any more than it needs Indians. He wheeled his horse around. We'll be watching. As the riders departed, Wilson turned to them apologetically. I'm sorry, this town, he shook his head. Where will you go? Boone looked to Moira, who stood gazing at her grandmother's grave, her face unreadable. I know a place, he said finally. Old line shack about 20 miles north of the Rocking R, remote but sound. Water nearby. He hesitated. You'd be safe there, Moira. At least until you decide what's next. She turned to face him, something like surprise in her dark eyes. You would help me still. I started this journey with you, Boone replied simply. Seems right to see it through. Within the hour, they had gathered their few belongings and ridden out of Palo Verde, the hostile gazes of townsfolk following their departure. Boone had purchased supplies from Wilson. The doctor refused payment for his services, and they set out north across the sun-baked landscape. For 2 days they traveled, speaking little. Moira's grief hung about her like a shadow, and Boone respected her need for silence. Yet somehow, the quiet between them grew comfortable rather than strained. They developed an easy rhythm, making camp, sharing tasks, watching the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. On the 3rd night, as they sat beside their small fire, Moira finally spoke of her past. She told Boone of her childhood among her people, of the raids and counter-raids that had gradually depleted their numbers, of the missionary school where she had learned English and the white man's ways. My mother wanted me to learn their language, she explained. She said, to survive the flood, one must understand the water. She was wise, Boone observed. Moira nodded. But understanding did not save her when the soldiers came. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes reflected the firelight like obsidian. My father died defending our camp. My mother and brother were shot trying to flee. Boone listened without interrupting, knowing these were words she perhaps had never spoken aloud. Grandmother and I survived because we were gathering plants in the hills, she continued. We watched our world burn from above. After we joined my cousin's band for a time, but conditions grew worse. Game disappeared, water sources were guarded. Eventually, we decided to surrender, go to the reservation. Her mouth twisted bitterly. The white man's prison for those they cannot kill. Not all white men want Indians dead, Boone said quietly. Moira's dark eyes met his across the flames. No, not all. She studied him for a long moment. Your parents, you said they died when you were young. Boone nodded, surprising himself by sharing the story he rarely told. How his father had established their small ranch in Texas, how the Comanche raid had left him fatherless at 14, how his mother had withered away soon after. How he had drifted west afterward, taking work where he could find it, never staying long enough to form attachments. The frontier teaches hard lessons, he concluded. Caring for people just gives life more ways to hurt you. Yet you cared what happened to us, Moira observed. Boone poked at the fire, watching sparks rise into the night sky. Guess I'm not as smart as I thought, he said with a wry smile. They reached the line shack the following afternoon. It was a simple structure, one room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and a roof that looked reasonably sound. Tall pines surrounded it, and a small stream gurgled nearby. It had been used as an outpost for cowboys working this section of the Rocking R Range, but with the drought forcing cattle closer to the main water sources, it stood empty. "It ain't much," Boone apologized as they dismounted, "but it's dry and hidden." Moira surveyed the cabin and its surroundings with approval. "It is good, defensible, water and wood close." She looked at him curiously. "But what of your job?" "Your ranch." "Rocking R can spare me a few days," Boone said, though he wasn't entirely certain that was true. "Can't just leave you out here with no supplies or protection." The truth was, Boone wasn't sure why he was still here, why he felt so drawn to help this woman. Perhaps it was her strength and dignity in the face of loss. Perhaps it was the way she challenged his belief that the frontier was no place for connection. Whatever the reason, he found himself reluctant to ride away. Over the next several days, they fell into a routine. Boone repaired the cabin's roof and chopped firewood while Moira gathered wild foods and cleaned the interior. In the evenings, they shared meals and stories, learning each other's ways. Moira showed him how to identify medicinal plants. He taught her to use his Winchester rifle. "Your boss will be angry you are gone so long," Moira observed on the fourth evening as they sat on a fallen log outside the cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. Boone shrugged. "Probably. Might not have a job to go back to." "Then why stay?" she asked, turning to face him. The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to voice. At 25, Boone had convinced himself that connection and attachment were luxuries a frontier man couldn't afford. Yet here he was, risking his livelihood for a woman he'd known less than 2 weeks. "Because for the first time in years," he said slowly, "I feel like I'm doing something that matters more than just surviving another day." Moira's expression softened, the usual guardedness in her dark eyes giving way to something warmer. "My grandmother would say you have a good spirit." High praise coming from her, Boone replied with a smile. "Yes." Moira looked away, back toward the sunset. "She would have approved of you." The words settled around them like a blessing, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of feelings neither had intended to develop. Boone found himself studying her profile, the proud line of her nose, the curve of her lips, the way her black hair caught the fading light. At 23, Moira possessed a beauty that went beyond her striking features, a dignity and resilience that drew him like a moth to flame. "I should return to the ranch tomorrow," he said finally, though the words tasted bitter. "Make sure I still have a job, bring back more supplies." Moira nodded, her face carefully neutral again. "Yes. That would be wise." That night as they prepared for sleep, Boone outside under the stars, Moira inside the cabin as propriety demanded, neither mentioned the unspoken thing growing between them. A cowboy and an Apache woman. The very idea defied the harsh realities of the frontier. Yet as Boone rode toward the Rocking R the next morning, Moira's image stayed with him, along with a nagging fear that he might never see her again. The thought troubled him more than he cared to admit. At the ranch, he found Richardson in a surprisingly forgiving mood. "Figured you'd run off for good," the ranch owner said gruffly. "But you're the best tracker I got, and we're still missing half a dozen head." "Sorry for disappearing," Boone offered. "Had a situation that needed tending." Richardson eyed him skeptically but didn't press. "Well, you're here now. Bunkhouse is still yours if you want it." Relief flooded through Boone, followed immediately by conflict. He could slip back into his solitary cowboy life, the simplicity of it, the lack of complication. Or he could return to the cabin, to Moira, to whatever uncertain future might await them. "Actually," he began hesitantly, "I was hoping to get some supplies, planning to use that old line shack up north as a base for tracking those strays." Richardson raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Take what you need." "But I expect to see those cattle found, Nichols." "Yes, sir." As Boone gathered supplies from the ranch storehouse, a voice called his name. He turned to find Sam Peterson, one of the other cowboys, approaching with a worried expression. "Heard you were back," Sam said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Thought you should know Dalton brothers were here yesterday asking about you. Boone's blood ran cold. What they want? Wouldn't say exactly. But they were mighty interested in where you might be holed up. Sam lowered his voice, and they mentioned something about an Apache woman. What did Richardson tell them? That he hadn't seen you, but Boone. Sam hesitated. Jeb Dalton's got a reputation. If he's after you, it ain't just talk. Boone nodded grimly. Thanks for the warning. Whatever you're mixed up in, Sam added, be careful. Boone rode hard back toward the lined shack, anxiety spurring him on. The Daltons knew he'd helped Moira escape Palo Verde. Their wounded pride, combined with their hatred of Indians, made them dangerous enemies. As he approached the cabin, a sense of wrongness prickled at his neck. No smoke rose from the chimney. No movement disturbed the surrounding trees. Moira, he called, dismounting quickly and drawing his pistol. The cabin door stood ajar, the interior in disarray. Signs of a struggle were evident: overturned furniture, scattered belongings. On the rough wooden table lay a single eagle feather, one Moira had worn braided in her hair. Cold fury and fear washed over Boone. He found tracks outside, several horses heading east. The Daltons had found her. Without hesitation, Boone reloaded his Winchester, checked his pistol, and mounted Thunder. The trail was fresh, less than 2 hours old. If he rode hard, he might catch them before nightfall. As he galloped across the landscape, following the tracks with grim determination, Boone confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. He cared for Moira more than cared. The frontier had taught him to guard his heart, to avoid attachments that made a man vulnerable. But somewhere along the way, this Apache woman with her quiet strength and proud spirit had slipped past his defenses. The tracks led toward Devil's Canyon, a remote ravine known for its maze-like passages and steep walls. A perfect place for an ambush, or a murder no one would ever discover. The sun hung low when Boone spotted them, 4 riders leading a 5th horse with a bound figure astride it. Moira. Even at this distance, he could see she was struggling against her bonds. Taking cover behind a rocky outcropping, Boone assessed the situation. 4 against 1, the same odds the Daltons had boasted of before. But they didn't know he was following, and surprise might give him an edge. As the group entered the mouth of the canyon, Boone circled wide, urging Thunder up a game trail that would bring him to the rim above. From there, he could follow their progress and perhaps find a better position to intervene. The light was fading fast as Boone reached the canyon's edge. Below, the Daltons had stopped in a small clearing, making camp for the night. He could see Moira, now tied to a tree, her posture defiant despite her situation. Jeb Dalton approached her, saying something Boone couldn't hear. Whatever it was made Moira spit in his face and earned her a backhanded slap that echoed off the canyon walls. Rage flooded through Boone. 4 against 1 or 40 against 1, he couldn't wait any longer. Taking careful aim with his Winchester, he fired a shot into the ground near the Daltons' campfire. The men scattered for cover, weapons drawn. Dalton! Boone shouted, his voice reverberating through the canyon. Let her go, and I'll let you live. That you, Nichols, Jeb called back. Come to save your Apache whore. One more word like that, Boone warned, and they'll be burying what's left of you come morning. Laughter echoed up from below. Big talk from a man outnumbered. Why don't you come down here and face us like a man instead of hiding up there? Boone, no. Moira's voice rang out clear in the twilight. They will kill you. Listen to the squaw, one of the brothers taunted. Save yourself, ride away. We just want to teach her kind a lesson about staying in their place. Not going to happen, Boone called back. He moved positions quickly, working his way along the rim to approach from a different angle. A shot rang out, the bullet chipping stone near his head. They'd spotted his movement. You can't save her, Nichols, Jeb shouted. But I'm feeling generous. Ride away now and we'll make it quick for her. Stay, and we'll make you watch before we kill you both. Boone's mind raced. Direct confrontation was suicide, but he couldn't leave Moira to their mercy. As darkness fell fully, an idea formed. The Daltons didn't know these canyons as well as they thought they did. Moving silently in the darkness, Boone worked his way down a narrow trail he'd discovered while tracking strays last month. It would bring him to the back of the clearing, behind where Moira was tied. The night was moonless, providing cover as he crept closer. The Daltons maintained a nervous watch, but their attention was focused on the rim where they'd last seen him. They didn't expect an approach from behind. Boone was within 30 yards of Moira when a loose stone betrayed his position. One of the brothers whirled, firing blindly in his direction. No more time for stealth. Boone fired twice in rapid succession, dropping one man with a shot to the chest. The others dove for cover, returning fire. "Moira, get down!" Boone shouted, charging forward through the darkness. The next minutes were a chaos of gunfire and shouted curses. Boone took a bullet across his left arm but kept moving, using the terrain for cover. A second Dalton fell to his Winchester, and a third, the youngest brother, fled up the canyon on foot. Only Jeb remained, crouched behind a boulder near Moira. "It's over, Dalton," Boone called, his voice steady despite the fire in his wounded arm. "Drop your weapon." "Not while I'm breathing," Jeb snarled. In one fluid motion he grabbed Moira, pressing his pistol to her temple. "Drop your gun, Nichols, or she dies right now." Boone froze, his Winchester trained on Dalton's position, but unable to risk a shot with Moira in danger. "Why die for an Indian?" Jeb demanded, his voice edged with desperation. "She's nothing, her kind murdered families all across this territory." "And how many of her people have whites killed?" Boone countered, trying to keep Dalton talking while he looked for an opening. "The killing needs to stop somewhere, Jeb." "It stops with her kind gone." Dalton tightened his grip on Moira, who remained eerily calm, her dark eyes fixed on Boone. "My life for yours," she said suddenly to Dalton. "Let him go, and I will not fight you." "No," Boone shouted. Dalton laughed bitterly. "Touching, the savage wants to save her white man." He jabbed the pistol harder against her head. "But I think I'll kill you both and tell folks how the Apache woman murdered poor Boone Nichols before I could save him." As he spoke, Moira moved, a quick, twisting motion that caught Dalton off guard. The pistol discharged, the bullet going wild as she drove her elbow into his ribs. They struggled briefly before Dalton shoved her to the ground, raising his gun for a killing shot. Boone's Winchester roared in the canyon night. Jeb Dalton crumpled without another word, his pistol falling unfired from lifeless fingers. For a moment neither Boone nor Moira moved, the echo of the gunshot still reverberating through the canyon. Then Boone rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, hands checking her for injuries. Moira shook her head, her breathing rapid but controlled. "No, but you are." She touched his bloody sleeve gently. "Just a graze," Boone assured her, though the wound burned like fire. "Can you ride?" "We need to get away from here before that last Dalton brings help." Together they gathered what supplies they could and mounted the Daltons' horses, leaving the dead where they lay. By dawn they had put miles between themselves and Devil's Canyon, heading north toward the territories where law was scarcer and questions fewer. They made camp in a sheltered grove as the sun rose. While Moira cleaned and bandaged Boone's arm, the full weight of what had happened settled over them. "I killed 2 men," Boone said quietly, staring into their small fire. "Maybe 3. "To save my life," Moira reminded him, her hand steady as she tied off the bandage. "They would have killed us both." "I know," he looked up, meeting her gaze across the flames. "And I'd do it again." Moira's expression softened. "Why?" It was the same question she'd asked him days ago, but now Boone had an answer. "Because somewhere between finding you in that wash and now, you became important to me." He swallowed hard, unused to such honesty. "More important than I thought anyone could be again." Moira was silent for a long moment, her face unreadable in the early morning light. Then she moved around the fire to kneel beside him, her hand finding his. "My grandmother once told me that souls recognize each other, even when they wear different skins," she said softly. "I did not understand until now." Boone reached up to touch her face, tracing the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "What happens now? I can't go back to the rocking R, not after this." And I cannot return to my people, Moira replied. The reservations are death and the free bands dwindle each season. Then we make our own way, Boone said with sudden certainty. There's land to the north in Colorado territory. Good water, fewer people, we could start fresh there. Together, Moira asked, a vulnerability in her voice he'd never heard before. Together, Boone confirmed, drawing her closer. If that's what you want. Her answer came not in words but in the press of her lips against his, tentative at first, then with growing certainty. It was a promise more binding than any frontier law or custom could create, a bridge between their separate worlds. They traveled north for weeks, avoiding settlements where possible, taking odd jobs when necessary. Boone's skill with horses and Moira's knowledge of natural medicines earned them enough to continue their journey. They faced suspicion and occasional hostility in the towns they passed through. A white man and an Apache woman traveling together drew notice everywhere. But they also found unexpected kindnesses along the way. In a small settlement near the Colorado border, they encountered a circuit-riding preacher willing to marry them despite raised eyebrows from the locals. The ceremony was brief, witnessed only by the preacher's wife and a puzzled stable boy, but it gave their union the legitimacy the white world demanded. Mrs. Nichols, Boone said with wonder that night, testing the words as they camped beneath the stars. Moira smiled, the expression transforming her serious face. Strange words. But good, she touched the simple band on her finger, crafted from a silver dollar Boone had carried since his father gave it to him on his 12th birthday. Never thought I'd be a married man, Boone admitted, drawing her against his side. Figured the frontier had no place for family. The frontier has always had families, Moira corrected gently. My people lived in family bands for generations. It was not the land that was hostile to families, but the conflicts of those who claimed it. Her wisdom struck Boone anew. Perhaps his belief that attachment and connection were luxuries a frontier man couldn't afford had been wrong all along. Perhaps it was precisely those connections that made survival meaningful. By winter they had found their place, a sheltered valley with good water and grass, far enough from established settlements to avoid immediate conflict but close enough to a trading post for necessary supplies. With the money Boone had saved from years of cowboy work, they purchased a small herd of cattle and began building a modest cabin. The work was hard, the winter harsh, but they faced it together. Moira's knowledge of wild foods and medicines supplemented their stores, while Boone's skills with livestock ensured their small herd survived the season. Spring brought new beginnings. The land greened, their cabin stood finished, and Moira shared news that transformed their future once more. A child grows within me, she told Boone one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold. Joy and fear mingled in Boone's heart, joy at the prospect of family, fear for what their child would face in a world that often rejected those of mixed heritage. Our child will have two worlds, Moira said, as if reading his thoughts. It is not a burden but a gift. Not everyone will see it that way, Boone cautioned, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Then we will teach them to see with different eyes, she replied with quiet confidence. As we have learned to do. Their daughter was born the following autumn, Sarah, named for Boone's mother, with a second name in Apache that honored Moira's grandmother. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's dimpled smile, a living bridge between their separate pasts. As their homestead grew, so did their family. A son joined them 2 years later, followed by another daughter. Their cattle multiplied and they added horses to their stock, sturdy Mustangs bred with eastern thoroughbreds, creating animals uniquely adapted to the Colorado highlands. The outside world intruded occasionally. A family of settlers established a homestead in the neighboring valley, initially wary of the mixed family, but eventually forming bonds of mutual support. A band of Ute Indians passed through seasonally, trading with Moira and sharing news of other tribes. The railroad pushed ever westward, bringing both opportunity and threat of encroachment. Through it all, Boone and Moira held fast to what they had built, not just a ranch or a family, but a new way of being that honored both their traditions while creating something uniquely their own. Their children grew speaking both English and Apache, learning to ride almost before they could walk, absorbing stories from both cultures around evening fires. There were hard times, drought years when the creek ran low, winters when snow isolated them for months, occasional conflicts with those who couldn't accept their union. But there were far more moments of joy, children's laughter echoing across the valley, successful roundups, evenings spent beneath stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. 10 years after they first met by that trickle of water in the Arizona desert, Boone and Moira stood together on the ridge overlooking their valley. Their ranch house, larger now than the original cabin, stood whitewashed in the distance. Cattle and horses grazed the lush grass, and their eldest children helped a neighboring ranch hand mend a section of fence. "Did you ever imagine this?" Boone asked, his arm around his wife's waist. At 35, his face showed the lines of a man who worked outdoors, but his eyes held a peace that had once seemed impossible. Moira shook her head, leaning into his embrace. "When you found me with my grandmother, I thought only of survival. One more day, one more mile." She smiled up at him, the years having softened some of her edges while strengthening others. "You showed me there could be more." "We showed each other," Boone corrected, remembering the lonely cowboy he'd been, convinced that the frontier allowed no room for love or family. "You remember what you told me once about souls recognizing each other." Moira nodded. "I think maybe that's what happened," he continued. "We were both lost in different ways. Together we found something worth fighting for." In the valley below, their youngest child, a girl of 4 with her mother's straight black hair and her father's hazel eyes, spotted them on the ridge and waved excitedly. Beside her, the family's old dog barked his greeting. Moira waved back, then turned to her husband with a smile that still quickened his heart after all these years. "Come," she said, taking his hand. "Our family waits." Hand in hand, they descended the ridge toward home, the sun warm on their backs, the future stretching before them like the vast frontier they had learned to love, not as solitary travelers but together.